should we strengthen the lower back against any of this? Well, I'm going to say no to that. We shouldn't strengthen it on a couple of levels. I mean, we do need to build the capacity of the lower back, but that includes strength, it includes endurance, and it includes stability of the spine. So again, it's a different approach than what most people will use. So strengthening the lower back and using range of movement for that is another thing I should say. So strengthening the low back with movement. Now, there is a time and a place for it, but for most people, it comes later. So, what does all that mean? Again, if we look at how the back becomes injured, and this is something I didn't mention, when we go to extreme ranges of movement, again, that's where the problem's sped up. If we use moderate movement, it's slowed down somewhat. But if we use extreme ranges of movement, it's sped up. Again, if we add load into that, it causes the problem. So, if you have lower back pain and you have triggers or a low back, if you have a flexion intolerant spine, which basically means your spine doesn't like flexion, it's probably not a good idea to put it into flexion and then load it. So by strengthening a lower back in that way, it's not going to be effective, because you understand that the trigger is flexion, you're then loading that flexion, and load with the flexion is only really making the problem worse. It's not necessarily making it better. So from that perspective, it's not a good idea to strengthen the lower back. If you have extension intolerance, so your spine doesn't like going into extension, the same can be said. So we have to understand the triggers. If we look at a disc herniation, how is a disc herniation caused? Full flexion and full extension of the spine. What that's basically doing is that's pushing the fluid in the spine backwards towards the outside of the spine until it bulges or until it herniates. So that causes that problem. So we start to see, well, if that's causing the problem, why am I doing that? So what we need to be able to do is we need to, first of all, be able to maintain a posture. So that's the first thing, which as a general sense is a neutral spine. And people don't like neutral spine. Okay, I'll use a more appropriate definition, which would be elastic equilibrium. So if you can imagine, you've got one vertebra sat on top of another, you've got two vertebrae, one sat on top of the other, and you've got, let's just say, elastic bands, one on the side, or one on the left, one on the right, one on the front, one on the back. If you flex it forward, obviously the back one becomes stretched and the front one goes slack. If you bend it to the left, the right one becomes stretched and the left one becomes slacked. Elastic equilibrium is where all those elastic bands are evenly tensioned around. That's what would be a neutral spine or an elastic equilibrium. Yes, there is a range to it. I understand that. And yes, it's very hard to maintain that 24/7. I understand that. But if you can hold it nearer a neutral spine or that elastic equilibrium, it's going to be more effective for you. Why? Because the load is distributed around the passive tissues of the spine more evenly. If you go into flexion or lateral flexion or rotation, they get concentrated. And that's what drives the micro injuries and the micro traumas and the stress fractures. So what we need to be able to do is distribute that load. So we would start from there. Then we would look at, well, there is nothing supporting the lumbar vertebra. So what we then need to do is we then need to activate the muscles around it. So we need to brace the abdominals. Now, we need to brace appropriately for the very simple reason, if we brace too hard, we may have a compression trigger to the spine. So it doesn't like lots of muscle activation around it. So we need to brace appropriately. And what we then need to be able to do is maintain that neutral spine through movement. So basically we hinge at the hip. So we've got neutral spine, brace the abdominals, hinge at the hip when it comes to movement, and also hinge at the shoulder when it comes to upper body movement. So again, we're not overly extending the spine when we take our arms up over our head. So we need to start thinking about it in that way when it comes to strengthening the lower back. First of all, we need to get the muscles active to stabilize. So just by bracing the abdominals, you will stabilize, just like the ropes on a sail will stabilize the sail. Just like guy wires on tent will stabilize the tent. When they are pulled taut, just like the muscles of your lumbar spine, they will hold those 5 vertebrae in place and stabilize it. Once you've got it stabilized, you can then start to think about bracing, and then you can start thinking about hinging at the hip and movement. So this then leads me on to the final part, is what is a more sensible approach to rehabilitating a lower back with everyday life and movement involved. And there are 4 basic points to this. Is 1, don't be too rigid. 2, don't be too sloppy. 3, be appropriate. And 4, we've got to think about what has been described as a low back pain account, if you will. So let's start number 1. Don't be too rigid. If you are too rigid with the spine, you will be too robotic, and that can cause its own problems. So where I've talked about being in a proper position, maintaining an elastic equilibrium, hinging at the hip, there needs to be, we can't be too rigid, we can't be too robotic. Now, if you are in the midst of a lower back pain episode and you know you have intolerances with flexion and extension or rotation or lateral flexion to the spine, then that is the time to be most rigid. So there is a time to be more rigid and there is a time to not be too rigid. But what we have to think about is we can't be rigid 100% of the time. When the pain starts to dampen, we can start coming out of that rigidness. Now that's not to mean that we then need to go in flowing types of movement, because that brings me on to part number 2, which is don't be too sloppy. Because if we're sloppy with our movement, that's going to take us back to that episode of pain that we had, where we have to then become rigid. So we go between these rigid and sloppy movements, if you will. And then you've got professionals and people and influencers who probably aren't professionals, that don't understand these things, that are telling you to move your spine, but that could be creating sloppiness, which then sends you back. So what we need to be able to do is be appropriate, which is point number 3. There is a time to be rigid, and there is a time, well, there isn't really a time to be sloppy, but you can be sloppy if you've built up a low back pain account, and I'll come on to that in a second. But when we talk about being appropriate, it's move the spine at an appropriate time. So if you need to lift something off the floor and you know you can't get down there with a neutral spine, you're going to have to use a flex spine. But don't be sloppy with that. Brace the abdominals to stabilize the vertebra in that flex posture. So there are caveats to these types of things that we need to understand.